Hey, it's Tara. Today I'm going to share some tips for baking with coconut flour. Have you ever looked at a coconut flour recipe, like really looked at it, and noticed that there's such a small amount of coconut flour compared to a traditional recipe? So say you're going to make just traditional muffins. There might be a cup and a half of flour. Then you look over at a coconut flour recipe that has the same yield. Maybe it makes a dozen muffins and it only calls for a quarter of a cup. So what is going on here? When I very first started baking with coconut flour, this really threw me off. I have been baking since I was 14 years old, and seeing that quarter cup, I just thought, that cannot be right. There is just no way that that recipe is correct. So of course I'm like, oh, okay, so I'm just going to substitute and add a little bit more. I mean, if you had been standing beside me when I pulled those very first cupcakes out of the oven, and I was so excited because they had risen, they looked good on the outside, and so I pulled one out and I cut that open, and you just cannot imagine how I felt when it was just grainy. It's really hard to describe what the texture was like. So coconut flour is tricky to bake with. Today I'm going to share tips and tricks that are important to know and remember every time you bake with coconut flour. I'm going to teach you how to get great results every time. In case you're new around here, make sure that you subscribe to my channel by clicking on the red subscribe button below. I post a new vlog and a new recipe every week. Okay, let's jump into how to bake with coconut flour. First of all, remember that you can never substitute coconut flour one for one when you're trying to convert a recipe. Maybe you have an old family recipe and you'd really like to convert it over to coconut flour. First, I want to cover the why behind these rules before we dive into the rules themselves. So coconut flour is highly absorbent. It really acts like a sponge. So when you combine the liquids and the eggs with the coconut flour, you actually want to let the mixture set. I usually let it set 2 or 3 minutes while I'm getting other things together. So to convert a normal recipe into a coconut flour recipe, the first thing you're going to need to know is that 1 cup of a regular flour is only going to be a quarter cup of coconut flour. But before you grab your measuring cups, I want to encourage you strongly to always weigh your coconut flour. The same is true with any nut flour, is to figure out what the weight is and weigh it. You can buy an inexpensive kitchen scale. And you know, funny story, I actually weigh everything I can now because I don't have to get 5 or 6 measuring cups dirty if I'm just weighing everything in a bowl. So it's pretty awesome once you kind of learn how to weigh your ingredients. So you're going to weigh your ingredients. So what's the conversion for weight? So 1 ounce of coconut flour would be a quarter cup of coconut flour. Therefore, for every 1 cup of flour, regular flour in your recipe, you're going to use 1 ounce of coconut flour. If you want to know how much 1 ounce of coconut flour is in grams, it's 28 grams. And there are some online tools and conversion calculators that you can use, and I will make sure that I post a link below in the comments. So make sure that you check out the comments section and the description of this video for more information. The next important thing to know about coconut flour is that it requires extra eggs. One of the most common comments on my coconut flour bread recipe is, why so many eggs? And that's just the nature of coconut flour. Eggs act as a binder, and it also helps the coconut flour rise. So it's really important to use an adequate number of eggs. The rule of thumb for eggs is for every ounce of coconut flour, you need to add an additional egg to the recipe. So if you're starting with a recipe that calls for 2 eggs, you want to use those initial 2 eggs and then add an egg for every ounce of coconut flour that you're going to use in this recipe that you're converting. So what if you're egg-free? I've had mixed results using flax eggs, but that's definitely something that you can try. You might have to adjust the liquids, which we're going to cover here in a moment. For those of you who don't know what a flax egg is, it's simply kind of making an egg substitute out of ground flax. So what you do is you take a tablespoon of ground flax and you combine that with, I believe it's 3 tablespoons of water, and you let that set. And it kind of turns into this kind of jelly. It's almost like an egg white consistency, and you use that for the number of eggs in a recipe. However, coconut flour is known to be kind of stubborn, so you may not have great results with every recipe you try in an attempt to get rid of eggs. Now let's talk about liquid. So you've got your eggs, you've converted over your flour, and now you need to figure out how much additional liquid that you need to add. And you do need to add additional liquid because, again, coconut flour it acts like a sponge and it expands. You're using a smaller amount, but it's going to expand into the same amount of batter that you would expect from a traditional recipe because of all this stuff you're adding, right? For every quarter cup, which is 1 ounce of coconut flour, you're going to add an additional quarter cup of liquid. So some of my favorite liquids to use are heavy whipping cream, and that's because we follow a low carb and ketogenic diet. You can also use water, you can use whole milk, almond milk, coconut milk. You can also use healthy oils such as avocado oil or maybe some extra virgin olive oil. If you're still struggling to get the binding, by binding I mean your finished product just kind of wants to fall apart, it doesn't want to hold up, try adding some xanthan gum. Start with just a very small amount of xanthan gum works. So you just want to start with something like a 1/4 teaspoon. Remember that when you're converting a traditional recipe into a recipe using coconut flour, it's going to take some trial and error. You can follow these simple rules that I've outlined for you to eventually get the perfect result. But be patient with yourself. Your very first batch is probably not going to be absolutely perfect. So let's talk a little bit about how to do this trial and error. So let's say that you've made a batch of muffins and they're just a little bit dry. You want them to be a little bit more moist. So what are you going to do? You could add an additional egg or maybe add an additional 1/4 cup of cream or milk or some other liquid to the recipe and see how that next batch turns out. Another tip for adding moisture would be to use a mashed puree, like a pureed vegetable or fruit. For those of you not on a low carb diet, you could use something like a banana. Bananas are fantastic. They also are a natural sweetener. I add those to banana muffins all the time when I bake for my kids. Also, I've heard of people using creamed spinach, creamed corn. You can use pumpkin. Pumpkin would be a fantastic option to add some more moisture. So now let's say that you've made a batch of muffins and the consistency is just wet and heavy. What are you going to do to adjust the recipe then? Well, here you might want to back off an egg and maybe even a little bit of liquid, or maybe just try one or the other. So you just want to experiment back and forth. Maybe you need to add just a tablespoon more of coconut flour. Maybe a tablespoon will be too much and it just needs a teaspoon. The best way to experiment when you're really getting started with this is to test bake one at a time. So if you're making a batch of muffins, just bake 1 muffin, see how it turns out in the end, and then adjust the rest of your batter. Same thing's true of cookies and things like that. It can save you a lot of headache until you get things going and you get into the flow and you document and have converted the recipes that you want to. Probably the best tip that I can share with you is to kind of forget about converting recipes. It would be a really great idea just to get your feet underneath you. Find a resource with some trusted recipes and just make them as is without making any changes. Once you've got the feel and you've kind of learned the ratios, it'll be a lot easier to go back and convert your own recipes. I have a number of recipes that I've put together for you in a coconut flour playlist. So make sure you check that out and see if I have anything that you're looking for. I have things like coconut flour bread, cupcakes, and a number of other things that I'm consistently developing. You can also bake with coconut flour by combining it with other flours. My favorite flour to combine coconut flour with is almond flour, and you'll find that kind of a scenario in my waffles recipe, which I have to say are amazing and you should definitely try those. So I'd really like to know, did I answer all your questions about coconut flour? What things did I confuse you at? What other questions do you have for me? So please comment in the section below. I tried to make this as complete as possible, so please let me know and I will absolutely respond to your comments. Before you go, I have just one more thing for you. To get my free Baking with Coconut Flour guide, just follow the links that popped up on the screen or that you can also find in the description section right underneath this video. And you can get my Baking with Coconut Flour guide for absolutely free just for joining my email list. Thanks so much for tuning in. If you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel below to be notified when I post my next video.